perhaps 10 minutes for discussion on the papers. Yes, 10 minutes. Then we will have a general discussion in the afternoon. Please. Marianne.
First, I wish to say, mea culpa, mea maxima, co-Professor Gomez. I got so excited by what you said. I've never interrupted a person in my whole life. In your whole life? Well, no, I mean, in this kind of formal presentation, so please, mea culpa. But you really excited me for a reason, and that is one of the things about this morning that was so beautiful was that each of you gave us ideas for applying in our own work, each of you. And not only did you give us ideas for applying, and I really want to say this as somewhat of a senior cognitive neuroscientist, you have expanded our reach so much. Each of you, I'm just thrilled to be here listening to you. And after saying that, I do have a few questions, as you might guess. Some of us have been doing a great deal of intervention research, and though we find those of us who are studying SES and poverty, we're finding always this gap between the poor. So Tommy has, by the addition of this social emotional component, showing us some of the first research that is showing more gains for the poor. But I want to ask both you and Sebastian whether or not you've ever analyzed the data to look at the amount of learning by each group. In other words, when we study it just outright, SES levels are always going to be below, except, of course, with Tommy's finding. But when we study learning curve, what we see is that there's always a gap before, and there's always a gap afterwards. But the learning curve in really good interventions is the same. So I want to ask you whether you've analyzed any of the data on the interventions in that way.
Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, Stefania, and then you will answer.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I join Marianne in really congratulating for this brilliant, exciting, and intriguing presentations. And I have a question, a couple of questions. First, for Sebastian, I'm wondering if you consider the link between your research about the correlation between poverty and cognition, focusing on second language acquisition. When you can see that there is a real certainty, as you know for sure, in literature, in basic research, which is age. You know, the earlier, the better. So we know for sure that if you start to learn a second language from the early childhood, independently on the conditions you live and the context and the environment, you'll have a very, very fast and you know, good process of learning, reaching the bilingualism for sure. So I was wondering if you can keep this kind of data and see how and which is the impact with the other kind of more social and environment facts that you consider in your research. The second is, if I may, for TAC, it's really exciting to see, you know, the question of listening as not simply a language skill, as you said, but a very powerful dimension of our learning process, and then it becomes a behavior, right, in terms of emotional and general aptitude. My question is, if you have some data about the measurement of the categories you put on the screen, because it's really could be very nice and helpful for us to see how we can address the 4.7. I will mention later, you know, which is the very core of everything we are discussing today. And it could be great to start with some quantitative approach and see how, you know, curriculum, teachers training, and all these fundamental dimension of learning and teaching process can be evaluated and measured and and have a solid basis to go ahead.
Yes. Yeah. Please go ahead.
Analysis in Israel, there are many children that Hebrew is not their first language. So they're also looking at the gains also of immigrant children and children who are raised in Israel. So we will see what happens with that. As to your question about listening, this has been a learning process for us as well. So we do have a measure, a more linguistic measure of listening and listening comprehension, and we see gains. But what we've come to realize is for this next cycle that we're starting to collect in September, that we need to develop a much more complex listening tools. And this is why now we're in touch with the International Listening Association, and there doesn't seem yet to be a well-rounded, validated tool, and we're taking this as a goal to develop one. And
there is one kindness curriculum.
So, for Marianne, of course, we also analyze learning curves. We have two kinds of results. Sometimes we observe what you described. So we see the gap at the beginning and at the end, even if we have gains for poor kids. But sometimes, especially regarding executive functions, some interventions, at least 2 of 7 in our experience, the gains of the poor kids overcome the high SES kids in the baseline. So I think that we need to keep going analyzing this. Of course, because of the impact of poverty on cognition depends on many factors: susceptibility, accumulation of factors, the time of exposure, etc. We should take in consideration the variability in different interventions for different kids in different contexts. But we have mixed results. I am not an expert in in the bilingual field, but I have 3 pieces of information. I understand that you are talking about the border of the 7 years described by Patricia Kuhl. So in that sense, you have the Bialystok findings, Ellen Bialystok, showing that executive functions can by bilingual exposure can improve or boost executive functions. That could be true in some places, for example in Bialystok studies. Others couldn't find the same, and there is a very nice experiment that was done by Manolo Carreiras in the Basque Center of Neuroscience with Euskera and Spanish, and he showed the same as Bialystok. So I think that we need to keep in mind that probably the complexity of exposure to 2 or 3 languages in the first 2 decades of life, but better in the first one, could be, at the moment, it's an hypothesis, could be a booster of cognitive development. But we need more evidence. Did I answer your question? Excellent.
And then there is a small bus bringing us to the pole. Thank you very much, but we will continue the general discussion in the